To our politicians, our governments, and our businessmen, only four things matter, and that is consumer spending, investment, government spending, and imports and exports. You would think that these metrics should have a very little impact on how our governments run and how our businesses act, but in reality, they have a huge impact. And this is why our politicians, businessmen, along with the general population, is being misguided by a metric we all know as GDP, or gross domestic product. The gross domestic product does not account for inequality. It is obsolete in the world of information technology and only accounts for the greed of man and not the good. In this presentation, I will be providing you all of the cons of the GDP and an alternative to the GDP. Let's start off with the first point. The GDP does not account for inequality, but in fact it increases it. Let's look at the countries which are on the top of the GDP right now. Most of them had colonial pasts, meaning that they used hundreds of years of slave labor to develop their industries. That gave them a head start. Now, if you compare those countries to the countries which were colonized or did not have that slavery, obviously you can tell that they had less developed industries. This makes the GDP inherently inaccurate for progress, and it makes it inherently inequitable. According to Professor Boushey, who's a professor and economist in Nigeria, he states that the GDP serves as a harsh colonial reminder to African countries. Secondly, just because the GDP is progressing doesn't mean that everyone does better. In fact, according to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, the top 1% benefit the most. According to a report done by economists in the Paris School of Economics and the University of California, Berkeley, the natural average of increase in income for the average American was 61% from the years of 1980 to 2014. In the same time frame, the pre-tax income increase for the top 1% has been 204%. I would also like to provide you with some quotes from a report from the State-Fitoussi Commission. What we measure affects what we do. So this GDP calculation is pushing governments and corporations to make their GDP as big as possible and making the pie as big as possible, but they often forget how that pie is being distributed. The assumption that all ships go higher when there's a higher tide is clearly wrong. This assumption is incorrect. As mentioned, economic growth via the GDP does not mean economic growth for everyone. As I've made clear to you in this point, just because GDP increases, not everyone benefits, and also the GDP should be completely embedded because it is unfair to begin with due to colonial pasts. GDP is obsolete in the world of information technology, as the GDP has no room for data. No data creation, no data science, and no data management. Back in the pre-internet era, to get information, you would have to either buy a book or a CD, and you would get that information by buying something physical, which costs money. In today's day and age, you can do a Google search and get that same information for virtually no cost. Now that has a big problem. According to the MIT Sloan Management Review, the same is true with the music industry and with most entertainment industries. Even though our consumers are consuming more and our producers are producing more of entertainment and data, the GDP has no room for that. Even though that is true and that there are a lot of more startups and companies which are focused on creating data and managing data, and we all know the giants of entertainment are all moving towards the cloud. With all that being said, the GDP has no room for that. This is particularly outrageous, as if you were to calculate the value of the information economy, it would yield a massive number. But the GDP is just ignoring that. This further implies that the GDP is missing many key categories, which is missing a lot of the growth that our people and our governments are having. The GDP focuses only on money and nothing else, which leads to the next point. Let's move on to the last point. GDP only accounts for the greed of man, not the good. According to Robert F. Kennedy, a former United States president, he states that the GDP measures everything except for what makes life worthwhile. Furthermore, it also completely ignores women's roles. A pregnant woman with 2 kids is just seen as a working woman. Furthermore, according to the book Counting for Nothing, it is said every time a woman is seen with an infant, it is just seen as a woman who's at work. This undermines what caretakers do, and this completely undermines the idea of a household and a healthy household. GDP does not even account for charity or voluntary work either. Say if there is an organization which has voluntary action amounting to $58,000 done every year, that is not even counted. Now, if you add all of these organizations up around the world, that adds up to a huge sum of number which is not accounted for. Also, a $1 trillion economy which functions on coal is seen equal to a $100 trillion economy which functions on renewables. That alone is also a very big reason why the GDP is obsolete, as we are on the verge of a climate crisis. This proves to you that the GDP does not account for anything but the greed of man, and that further proves to you why it should be completely finished. I am sure that you are now convinced that the GDP is not a great system, and in fact, we must change it. So let's be constructive and look at an alternative for GDP. Let me unleash to you the idea of GPI, or Genuine Progress Index. The GPI calculations are based on the GDP, but they reach out to a more socio-economic and sustainability mindset as well. The GNI accounts for real wealth and well-being, with factors such as voluntary activities and domestic works provided as a positive for the index, and factors such as unemployment and crime, natural resource depletion, and pollution as a loss of wealth, as seen on this little table over here. This provides a solid basis for progress of the nation. Because sure, the GDP can go up, but the people's well-being could actually be going down at the same time, which is not real progress. It's just monetary progress. And you may be wondering right now, how does the GPI compare to the GDP? Well, in reality, as the GDP in the United States has tripled over the last few years, the GPI has actually decreased. And in Canada, it just stayed the same despite our GDP increasing. This is a strong issue. Just because a GDP is increasing doesn't mean that people are doing well overall. Furthermore, we're only focusing on a single prospect of progress, and that is economic prosperity. It is inherently inaccurate, as many countries have a head start. As I talked to you about the colonial pasts, it does not help everyone. Just because the GDP increases doesn't mean everyone does better. And it definitely is not accounting for women's roles and caretakers' roles and volunteerism. And as we said, it also does not account for the greed of man and not the good. And definitely we think that it will not continue, as more and more jobs are going into the data and information industry, and the GDP just clearly does not count that at all. Using GPI, we can imagine a world where progress is holistically calculated, where wealth is distributed more equally, the environment is kept sustainable and usable for future generation success, a world where the government gets a spotlight, not because you're just a consumerist, because you are a well-rounded citizen which cares for others and yourself. A world where leisure is seen as a benefit and not a negative. With the new metric of the GPI, or Genuine Progress Index, this future world can be possible. Thank you for your time.